lived in Friedrichshain for 45 years, and then come to Pennsylvania. The story also is somewhat troublesome in Pennsylvania, because in Pennsylvania, there are already people living here, a culture vastly different than our own, a very ancient culture, and part of our story is that we push the people that lived here out. I've been asked to talk about that because this is an important part of me doing my own research. I'm very interested in the impact of colonialism here at the local level. We're in Manor Township, that's where a lot of this happened. The impact of the relationship between colonial people, European people, even Mennonites, and the Native Americans here. So I do have a short slide presentation here, 10 interesting facts of Native Americans in the Conestoga watershed, and we'll go through these here, and I guess there'll be a little time for questions. Hopefully I can do this in about 20 minutes and leave a little bit of time for questions as well. So first off, I want to say that these are very ancient people that lived here, 400 or 500 generations. They come from the time during the Ice Age, when the sea levels were lower. They come from Asia. They come over across the bridge that would have linked Siberia and Alaska, and then begin to inhabit all of North and South America. Of course, we had ice in the northern part of Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna River is actually carved through what were glaciers at one point. If you take an airplane from Harrisburg and fly north, I've done this, I've flown to Toronto from Harrisburg, you can see the river cutting through the ridges of the Allegheny Mountains. How does that form? It forms because there were glaciers here at one point. The Native Americans, as that ice was receding, the Native Americans lived here. They were hunter-gatherer people at that time. They would have hunted the large animals. We had these hairy elephants that we call mammoths and mastodons that lived here that went extinct because of humans hunting them. They would have hunted these animals. They would have hunted reindeer. They possibly brought some plants over as well, perhaps some squash and things like that at that time. And then later, they began to farm. Here I have a picture of some of the older squash varieties. These yellow-neck squash that we have today, of course the genetics is a little bit different now, we hybridize everything. But these yellow-neck squash are native to the Ohio River Valley and this area of the Susquehanna. Also, in my yard, you know, I don't use chemicals in my yard. I'm getting more conscious of that. And now I have these little strawberries that are really, really small that come up in my yard. And strawberries are indigenous to here. And they're coming up in my yard. Now, I try to eat them, and they're not very flavorful. But Native Americans had these foods as they began their agriculture here in the Ohio River Valley and in the Susquehanna regions. They had sunflowers. I was up in the Genesee Valley of New York. You see tons and tons of sunflowers now. They ate the roots of the sunflowers have tubers, somewhat like a sweet potato. They ate the roots of the sunflower and the seeds of the sunflower. And they also had this knotweed that we consider a weed today, but they would have eaten this as well and grown this for food, something like lettuce, and also chewing it when they were on long trips to help quench the thirst and to provide nutrition. Other plants that we consider weeds today, this lamb quarters here, I think my pointer's not going to work on the screen, but you see the plant up there on the upper right. We call that lamb quarters. This is found in your gardens, and you pull it out. You know what I'm talking about. The Native Americans actually produce this agriculturally. They planted it purposely in their gardens, and then they used it as a type of lettuce, as a type of vegetable, a plant that they could eat, make soups out of, and to chew to help to quench the thirst. The pawpaw fruit. How many of you have eaten pawpaw? Many of you have. Okay, this is indigenous to the Ohio River Valley, West Virginia area, and here as well in the Susquehanna. There are pawpaw groves over on Turkey Hill, about 3 miles from here, that would have existed, not the same trees obviously, but the ancestors of those trees would have existed back 400, 500 years ago when the Native Americans had a large presence here along the river. And then we have the most prominent food in the world today that comes from Native Americans. In fact, if we look at the vegetables that we eat today, most of the vegetables we eat today are Native American. We have to remember that Native Americans were farmers. Let's talk about potatoes, corn, beans, peppers, squash, any kinds of squash, pumpkin, even zucchini today. Zucchini is a little bit of a hybrid, but all these squash, beans like lima beans and green beans, all these foods are Native American foods, and these are the staples of our diet today, vegetable-wise. What comes from Europe? Well, peas and wheat, our bread, our wheat-based diet comes from Europe. Turnips and cabbage come from Europe. But all these other foods were cultivated by Native Americans. Somehow they were able to take this teosinte from the mountains of Mexico, the highlands of Mexico, and they were able to cross it with this tripsapkin, and they began to make corn. Corn comes here to the Susquehanna region about 3,000 years ago. This happened maybe 7,000 years ago, that time frame, in the mountains of Mexico. Now, I was at Mesa Verde a few years ago, and a guide at Mesa Verde talked about how they did this, and it's very interesting because the very early corn looks like my picture on the left. But what Native Americans did in terms of honoring their creator, they would take the best of the grains and they would give that as a sacrifice back to their creator as an honor. So rather than eating the best of their grains, they would save those grains and then they would plant those back in the ground the next year in ceremony. Now what happens when you do this year after year after year after year? Generation after generation. Perhaps they didn't realize it, but what happens when you take the best of your seed and you save that and you plant that the next year? You're going to get a corn that looks like what's on the left, and eventually it turns into a corn on the right. And this happens over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. Native Americans were able to do this. They did this with corn, they did this with potatoes, they did this with the various beans that we have, all the staples that we have in our vegetable diet today. Here's a map that shows corn developing from the highlands of southern Mexico, coming into the western areas of the United States about 4,000 years ago, and then coming into the Ohio River Valley, and then ultimately up into the Susquehanna as well, and ultimately to the point that it can be grown in southern Canada too now. Here's another intriguing piece about Native Americans here. The petroglyphs along the Susquehanna. Some of them are inundated by the dams today, because we have 3 dams. We have the Safe Harbor Dam, the Holtwood Dam, and the Conewago Dam today. But you can see here on this map, the ones in red are the ones that are submerged. The other ones here are still viable. If you go out in canoe, you can see some of them. And you can see some of the pictures here that I have on Big Indian Rock that's found in the middle of the Susquehanna. There is a picture on there of a well-endowed fat man, let's say, pointing up towards the Conestoga River. And then there's a skinny man pointing over towards the York County side. Now, what would that mean? Obviously, even before Europeans arrived, the fertility of the land in Manor Township was exceptional, some of the best in the world. We can say that, it's true. We have some of the best land for agricultural purposes here in the world. Native Americans were farmers. So when Native Americans first come to what's now Pennsylvania, where do they settle? They settle in Manor Township and they begin to grow their food here. I mean, that's very obvious. We have more Native American sites in terms of where Native American artifacts have been found. There's more in Manor Township than there is anywhere else in Pennsylvania. There is more presence of Native Americans here in Manor Township along the Conestoga and along the Susquehanna than anywhere else. Now, let's move to the 1400s, a few hundred years before first contact. Europeans and Native Americans, before first contact. What's happening here in Lancaster County? You see we have two large people groups. We have in the purple the Iroquois type peoples, the Susquehanna, the Erie, the Onondaga, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, and then to the east of us we have the Algonquin type tribes, the Lenni Lenape, the Delaware, the Nanacoke. Lancaster County becomes a type of dividing line between these tribes. Typically, you would want to look at the watersheds. So the far eastern part of the county, where there are streams that flow towards the Schuylkill and towards the Delaware, particularly in Chester County and such, these are Lenape regions. But the streams that flow towards the Susquehanna would be the Susquehannock peoples, a Iroquois-type people that lived here. This becomes the dividing line between these two cultures just 100 years, 200 years before Europeans arrive. First European that makes mention of the Susquehannock peoples that lived here in Manor Township is John Smith. Now, John Smith is this short guy. I'm 6 foot tall. John Smith would stand about this tall. He forms Jamestown, 1607. He has an excellent journal, and you should read it sometime. It's been published many times, where he goes and he takes a crew of 13 in a small boat, and he goes and records all the inlets on the Susquehanna, on the Chesapeake Bay, up to the Susquehanna. So all through the Chesapeake Bay, he's recording all these inlets, because what's important for Europeans is mapping the area. They want to claim this area before the Spanish or before any other European power claims it. How they're going to claim it? They're going to map it. They're going to map it and prove that they've been here. As John Smith is doing this, he's describing the Native Americans that he encounters in this whole region. And he lists the towns by name, and I have them on that map. It's hard to see here, but I have them on that map, the various towns that he names all over the Chesapeake Bay and such. And then he gets up to a village called Taqua, which is now on the Sassafras Creek on the eastern side of the bay. And he asks these people, well, who are you subordinate to? And they say, well, it's the Susquehannock people, the people of the Muddy River. And John Smith says, well, I want to meet them. And so these people at the Taqua, they say, well, it'll take us 2 days. Meet us at the head of the river. We're going to go up and talk to them at their village, and they will come down and meet you at the mouth of the river, at the mouth of the Susquehanna, like where Havre de Grace is today. So John Smith waits a few days, and he goes over there to meet them. And John Smith is completely impressed. He describes in his journal these Susquehannock people. They're mighty warriors. He's more impressed with these people than any of the other Indians that he encounters. And he describes the chief. And this is how he describes him. He has the head of a bear sitting on his shoulder with his arm coming out of the mouth of the bear. And then he has the strap on his back and the head of another bear sitting on this shoulder with his mouth coming out of that bear. Now, can you imagine? This happened 1608, 400 years ago. John Smith, first time this Susquehannock chief encountered a European. And this is the presence of him. We had a sculptor up in Vermont that looked at this story, and he sculpted what that Susquehannock chief looked like from the description of John Smith. And here we go. Could you imagine encountering this? This is here. Well, he lived in Manor Township. He lived at Washington Borough. The meeting took place down at where Havre de Grace is today. But this chief would have lived here in Washington Borough, 1608. Here's some artifacts from Washington Borough. Some combs that were made out of deer antlers. They were potters as well. They made pots and various artifacts out of clay here locally. This is a small map that shows the town of Canandaigua, which is, Conestoga is a derivative of Canandaigua. This is a town that the archaeologists call the Strickler site, that is just north of Turkey Hill Mountain. As you're going on River Road from Turkey Hill Dairies to Washington Borough, and you go down the mountain as you enter the open fields, this would sit just on the right. It is a town that had 90 longhouses in the town, and it was fortified by 2 stockades, encompassing about 13.5 acres. When these towns were surveyed back in the 1960s by Fred Kinsey, he projected that about 2,500 to 2,800 people lived in the town. This is a town, or even a city, compared to what's there today. There are just farms there today and a few houses. But at that time, there would have been almost 3,000 people of Native American heritage living here along the river, fishing from the river, taking venison and bear from the areas, and farming. And that farming would have extended at least as far as we are here today at Manor Church, probably as far as Millersville. In terms of to support 3,000 people, there would have had to been a lot of farming done all throughout Manor Township to provide the resources for that many people. Some more items found from the Strickler site, from Canandaigua. You see the metal pots here. This is from European influence now. These would have been artifacts post-colonialism, or post-contact anyway, as they were not a metal culture. They were a Stone Age culture here, but once Europeans came, they began to trade these metal products as well. The influence of the Susquehannocks is the yellow piece here. The Susquehannocks had influence over much of the northern part of the Chesapeake, and even down to the Nanacoke tribes down where Lewis, Delaware is, and Rehoboth Beach, and that whole area. They had influence over this whole piece in the 1600s. 2 outbreaks of smallpox occurred in 1661 and 1663, and that decimated the tribe. So that town of Canandaigua, which is the forerunner of Conestoga, was decimated by these smallpox outbreaks. Who brings smallpox? Europeans do. After they were decimated by that and various wars with the colony of Maryland to the south, the tribe moves over to the York County side. I give tours of these Native American sites at various times through the Historical Society. We visit Canandaigua, we go over to York County, we visit the sites over there as well. Keep in mind, the story fits together with Pennsylvania as well, because if the Susquehannocks weren't here, we would be Maryland. I mean, maybe that'd be okay, but we would be Maryland. There wouldn't have been an opportunity for William Penn to secure a land grant from England to create his holy experiment in what we have as Pennsylvania today. The Susquehannocks were living here, and that prevented the Marylanders from coming further and further north during the 1600s. Maryland is a far older colony than Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was founded in 1681. Maryland was founded in 1632. Here's one of the older maps, the oldest map that I have found, that mentions the word Conestoga, the word that we have for our river here. And can you find it on the map? It's in the far right. You see my pointer there? That word right there, at the same level as my pointer, is Conestoga River. This map is pointing north to the right, so you can see the Susquehanna here and the Conestoga flowing into the Susquehanna. If we would orient the map, if we would flip it on its side, it would look more like a normal map where north is pointed to the upper part today. That's the oldest map. This is 1673, a map made by Augustus Herman from Maryland, before Pennsylvania was founded. Talked about the York County sites. They moved over to York County. The Conestoga, the Susquehannock Indians, soon to be called the Conestoga Indians, moved over to York County. They spent some time in Maryland. They were forced down to Maryland on a reservation. They began to come back in the 1690s, and they formed a village of a few hundred people called Conestoga Indian Town. How many know where it's at? It's not far from here. Indian Marker Road. The historical site put a marker there in the 1920s. There's a little hill called Indian Round Top, known as Chief's Hill by the Native Americans. This is where they lived when William Penn visited in 1701, signed a peace treaty with them. William Penn, of course, being an enlightened European, and saw the humanity in the people that lived here before. And when William Penn came to them, the story goes that he smoked the peace pipe with them. He danced with them. He participated in their culture. And he said, although we are two people, we are like one body with two hands. We are the same. We are one. Even today, if you go to Oklahoma and you visit the descendants of the people here, they have great admiration for William Penn. William Penn treated them with honor. I have a series of maps here that show what happens during colonialism. Pennsylvania in 1690, 3 counties. The blue is Chester, the yellow is Philadelphia County, the green is Bucks County. Let's move 15 years. The expansions further and further west. 1705. We're not even at the time the Mennonites come yet. First Mennonites arrive in Lancaster County, 1710, 5 years after this. You see the red piece along the river there on the left side. That's Conestoga Indian Town. Everything that's blue, yellow, and green are where Europeans settled by this time in what's now Pennsylvania. 1710. That blue piece there, close to Conestoga Indian Town, is where the Mennonites settled in 1710. The early families, where the Hans Herr house is, the Herrs, the Oberholzers, the Millers, the Kendings, those family names. 1710, a dozen families came. 7 years later, 80 families come. This is when the Hershey's arrived. The Hershey's are part of this group of 360 men plus their wives and children that arrived in August 1717. And where do the second group of Mennonites settle? They settle around the first group. So the first group is the area from Strasburg to Willow Street. The next group settles to the north, the west, and the south of the first group. So we have our Hershey's settling over here along Rohrerstown Road area, and we have the Brewbakers, and we have the other families that are part of the 1717 migration that occur. Look how close they are to where the Native American settlements were at Conestoga Indian Town compared to everybody else. we have the story, and you know the story, 1763, the Paxton boys from the Harrisburg area come down. This is, of course, during the French and Indian War. There were a lot of squabbles on the frontier. There were Europeans that settled to the north side of the Blue Mountain illegally. There was the Hofstadter family that was massacred by Indians coming from across the Blue Mountain. The Paxton boys came in to Conestoga Indian Town and massacred the Indians that were there. Several of them were out selling wares the night before and stayed overnight at farms. A few of them stayed at my ancestor Peter Swar's farm. Peter Swar lived just on the west side of where Park City is today. Those that survived this massacre were gathered up by the magistrate in Lancaster, and they were put in the jail in Lancaster for their protection. The jail is where the Fulton Opera House is today. 2 weeks later, while the magistrates were having their Christmas service at St. James Episcopal Church, which is there in Lancaster today, you can go there today, the Paxton boys came in, broke into that jail, and massacred the rest of the Native Americans that were in there for their protection. December 1763. Supposedly, this was the last of the Native Americans in Lancaster County. However, Michael and Mary had been in hiding on the Christian Hershey farm. You were there yesterday on the tour, and you saw these graves. They hid out the rest of their lives on the Christian Hershey farm, just close to Mannheim, to our north here. This picture is about 10 years ago, and this is how their graves looked at that point. I think it looks much better today, right? I mean, it's fixed up now, and maybe there's even a sign there today, right, that shows this. And there were others. There were others that hid out that survived this as well. Of course, many Native Americans saw this coming, or saw the tensions brewing over the years, and they fled into the frontier before the massacre happened. After the massacre, there were certainly Native Americans that knew and honored that their ancestors were the ones that lived at Conestoga Indian Town, and we even have that today. In 2012, we at the Hans Herr House, we set up the Lancaster Longhouse to commemorate Native Americans that had lived here in Lancaster County as a way to honor the people that lived here before Mennonites arrived. So on the complex of the Hans Herr House, we now have a longhouse, a house that depicts the type of houses that Native Americans lived in when they were here in Lancaster County. And I will close with this prayer. For me to read this prayer, I'll have to go down here, I think. But I choose this prayer. This is a Lakota prayer. Lakota is, of course, a tribe from the Dakota areas of the Midwest, written in the 1880s. But I choose this prayer because it signifies the humility and gratitude towards the Creator that Native Americans have. And so I'll close with this prayer. O great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds, and whose breath gives life to all of the world, hear me, for I am small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things that you have made, and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things that you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons that you have hidden in every leaf and in every rock. I seek strength, not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, the enemy within, that is myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so that when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Amen.